Yes, like I'll run down the argument for fine tuning. Why I think it's a pretty powerful argument, and then you can ask me questions.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm gonna run down the argument and the premises, and I'm gonna present some of the fine tuning evidence, and I'm gonna use a couple illustrations to support my premises. So the basic fine tuning argument, it uses Bayesian reasoning. So let's say you have two non-ad hoc theories, T1 and T2. In the context of background information B, it's true of evidence that if the probability of the evidence of E under theory 1 is much greater probability of the evidence of E under theory 2, and the evidence strongly favors T1 over T2. And what I mean by ad hoc is that generally they have independent motivations that have possibly been advocated prior to discovery of evidence E. And so the second premise is the likelihood of a life-permitting universe or naturalism is vanishingly small. The likelihood that a life-permitting universe exists on theism is not vanishingly small. Therefore, the evidence of a life-permitting universe strongly favors theism over naturalism. So, as to what pieces of evidence we have of fine-tuning.
We can. Am I free? Do you mind if I go? Because I'm not really interested in the specific constants because that's kind of irrelevant to my criticism.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, if anybody else isn't familiar with the arguments, they can look at some of these cases of fine-tuning. And these constants, they fall into very tiny ranges of all of the possible parameter space. It's astronomically improbable. These constants and these initial conditions of the universe would fall into these narrow ranges.
Yeah.
And
so I want to start.
let me give some illustrations right now.
Okay. It's kind of not going to be relevant to anything. It's not going to be relevant to anything I'm going to say. So if you want to do it for other people, I suppose it's just
Detroyer, what's going on, buddy?
Really interesting.
Yeah, fuck you, Detroyer. Canadian bastard.
So yeah. Basically, I'm gonna give some illustrations of how we use this Bayesian reasoning. Say, like a physicist, they want to compare the probability of Newtonian mechanics versus general relativity. These theories are not ad hoc, so they fit my criteria. But the priors, they're really difficult to determine whether we have a prior view that the universe is more likely to be Newtonian or relativistic. But we can still compare specific evidence, like the orbit of Mercury, look at the evidence on the Newtonian mechanics and general relativity, and find that evidence of the orbit of Mercury strongly supports general relativity over Newtonian mechanics. Now here's an illustration, which I took from Luke Barnes, which is called the hypothetical awesome theistic argument. There's some physicists doing some research in the lab, and they make this amazing discovery. They find out the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John are written on every atom. Now somebody who's a naturalist, they're like really surprised. They might have some objections. Like, oh, sure, it's really improbable. The Gospel of John might be on every atom. But improbable things happen all the time. Or they might say that Or they might say that he wrote 5 verses. Why didn't he write 6? Why didn't he write 4? Why didn't he write the Gospel of Matthew? But still, when we look holistically at considering the evidence, we're comparing theism and naturalism, we see that there's evidence of the Gospel of John. Under naturalism, it's vanishingly small, extremely improbable. Under theism, we can see why it is possible, and why we do think that it's not vanishingly small, that God would want to do that. Therefore, if we found this evidence of the Gospel of John, we would say that it strongly favors theism over naturalism. So I think the fine-tuning evidence it favors theism over naturalism in the same way, and yeah, I think part of it is like you can make objections. If you make an objection to the fine-tuning argument FTA, say how it doesn't undercut ATA, because I think we could all agree that the Gospel of John that would be pretty compelling evidence, even if
yeah, it is. So actually, this is something I've I've written down. I haven't made the video yet. It's something I'm covering in my follow-up video. The version of that I heard from Luke Barnes was that it was star writing. You know, the stars were arranged to form the verses of John or something. But it's basically the same thing. And I'll just be quick on that. I think the relevant difference there is that we have background evidence that bears on that hypothesis that doesn't apply in the regular fine-tuning case. That is to say, we have background information on the sort of ways in which linguistic expressions like that tend to come about, right? They tend to come about by agents with linguistic competence. There's a significant correlation with some other display of linguistic competence. I would infer that a good explanation for that, or the likely conclusion of that, is that there's something capable of displaying linguistic competence that is in some way connected to the other verses that we've seen in the Bible that's responsible for that. Whereas there's just nothing analogous of that in the fine-tuning case. And in the star writing or atom writing case, if we didn't have any independent evidence like that, it would be perfectly analogous to the fine-tuning case. So I just want to, we can talk about that more, but I wanted to hone in on what my issue with the argument that you presented is, which was, I guess I'll start with a question. When you in the first premise, when you say then E strongly favors T1 over T2, what is the favoring relation there? Does it mean that the posterior probability will be higher or much higher, or does it mean that when you update the probabilities, our posterior on the first theory is much higher than the prior on that theory than for the other theory? In other words, the Bayes factor might be quite high.
Yeah, it's mostly related to the Bayes factor. We leave the priors undetermined for this conversation.
Yeah, well, I don't think you can do that because the whole point of my my criticism that I present in the video is that I think the constraint on the priors is false. I think that prior on the designer hypothesis that would do the work that the fine-tuning argument requires of it, I think the prior is going to be vanishingly small. In fact, it's going to be at least as small as to counteract the Bayes factor. So, and I think, actually, I do a derivation of that from two assumptions in the video. In the upcoming video that I've been lazy and haven't gotten around to doing because I've had other things to do, I'm going to go into that a little bit more, and I have a bit of a more concise version of the derivation, and I have to respond to a couple more objections on the second constraint. But just for now, I can send you the updated document on that. But just for now, the two constraints I have are one. Also, I talk in terms of designer and non-designer hypothesis. I don't like talking in terms of theism and naturalism. A, because I think theism is just a loaded term and actually does a disservice to the fine-tuning argument. And B, I don't even know what naturalism is. So I'd rather just talk in terms of non-design hypothesis, that there is, say, a universe that wasn't designed. Anyway, the two constraints I have are, one, our prior on the bare design hypothesis is not higher than our prior on the bare non-design hypothesis, where the bare designer hypothesis just says there's a universe and it was designed. And the bare non-designer hypothesis says there was a universe and it wasn't designed. It doesn't tell us anything about what sort of universe would be designed or not designed, or what sort of designer would exist. So, in other words, those priors were antecedently agnostic between, where they're on a par. I think that's a pretty charitable prior. And I don't expect pushback on that one. The one I would expect pushback on, for those familiar with this sort of stuff, is the second constraint, which is that the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare designer hypothesis does not exceed the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare non-design hypothesis. And without getting too much into it, the main thought is that if you're just told that there's a designer, you're not told in any way how it is disposed to design. Any universe that could have existed on the non-design hypothesis more or less could exist on the design hypothesis. And I don't see any reason to think that the bare designer hypothesis would make a life-permitting universe likely or more likely than on the bare non-design hypothesis. And we could talk a bit more about those two constraints. I'm not sure if I've made that very clear, but from those, I think you can just prove that unless the only data, the relevant data is that the actual universe is life-permitting, the posterior of the designer hypothesis cannot exceed the posterior of the bare non-design hypothesis, as a fact of mathematics. Of course, if you bring other data to bear, it might, as in the case of the star writing or atom writing case. I think it would, but I think this is my main criticism. And the point is, again, what's wrong about the original argument, or the normal Bayesian argument as it's presented, is the constraint on the priors. If you ignore the priors and say that we can just talk about the conditional probabilities, or you put some constraint on them and say that they're close enough so that the difference in the conditional probabilities will swamp the difference in the priors, that I'm going to deny. And I think my kind of points and derivation will support that. But I didn't really get into either the two constraints I talked about or the derivation, but if you want, I could get into that.
Yeah, I guess I guess I would have problems with the bare design hypothesis, the way you formulated it, which is why I think the vision that I presented from Luke Barnes is a lot more forceful. And yeah, because if you go with a bare design, you're gonna have to make some kind of ad hoc assumptions about the designer intention. And,
sorry, I did actually forget to mention something. The point was that I don't want to just compare the bare non-design and bare design hypothesis. The point was that given these two constraints, although they only mention the bare design hypothesis and the bare non-design hypothesis, the point is that whatever more substantive designer hypothesis you might present, for example, Luke Barnes has something to do with the designer being loving or something like that. You're adding in further features like that, which will make further predictions. That's going to, or at least might, more strongly predict the data, the life-permitting conditions, than the bare designer hypothesis. But if my kind of constraints are correct and the derivation is correct, it's going to have a correspondingly lower prior, so that the posterior will actually not exceed the bare non-designer hypothesis when we condition on the data. So the point is that whatever you add in, you could add in anything to the bare designer hypothesis to predict the data. Just in terms of Bayesian reasoning, I mean, you might have something else. You can say some other sort of non-Bayesian reason to prefer the theory. Just in terms of Bayesian reasoning, it won't go through, in the sense that whereas you might more strongly predict the data, you're going to have a correspondingly lower prior. It's going to cancel it out. And my derivation is kind of showing that would be the case.
so I guess I wouldn't put it, like if I had to formulate it, I wouldn't put it in terms of bare design and bare non-design. Because, for example, I think my argument, I don't know if you know John Leslie, he's also written
Yeah.
about fine-tuning, but he's a pantheist, so like when it comes to the bottom of it, he wouldn't say that the universe is designed in the theistic sense, but there's still like a metaphysical reason at the bottom of it why these constants tend to be why these constants end up being life permitting. So I think like the evidence, it's like it's compatible with theism, it's compatible with some varieties of non-naturalism, like pantheism, but I think it's like vanishingly small under naturalism. So I think yeah, the fine tuning is pretty compelling evidence against naturalism.
Yeah, well, I don't. When I was talking about the designer hypothesis, it sounds like maybe you're broadening this to include any sort of explanation. I'm not sure. I was just thinking in terms of some agent that can create the universes, or at least a universe. And that's how I'm thinking about the design hypothesis, like under question. If you want to broaden that to include something pantheistic, I mean, I'm not even sure that pantheistic is really distinct from what you might call naturalism. So you have to get into that. It's not really relevant to my point. Let me just, for sake of clarity, summarize what my main issue is. I think that the sort of designer hypothesis that's going to do the work that the fine-tuning argument requires, it's going to like predict at least somewhat the life limiting conditions, and whether it entails them or just makes them somewhat likely or not so unlikely, right? That hypothesis is going to be much more committing. It's going to be much more substantive than, say, my bare non-designer hypothesis. And given the constraints I set or argue for, while the designer hypothesis you might use more strongly predicts the data, it's going to be antecedently less probable, such that when you conditionalize on the data, the posterior is not going to exceed the posterior on the bare non-design hypothesis. And so the data is not going to. What's misleading about the fine-tuning argument, I think, is that we're comparing a rather specific hypothesis with a rather non-committing hypothesis. It doesn't really say much. And while the specific hypothesis more strongly predicts the data, it's antecedently less likely, such that actually it cancels out. It kind of balances out. And the data doesn't prefer the more specific hypothesis over the less specific one, even though the conditional likelihood of that data on the specific hypothesis is much higher. So that's kind of, to illustrate that point, I give the die example. We could talk about ad hocness. I don't think that's actually relevant to this kind of Bayesian reasoning, but and I mean the hypothesis could be made non-ad hoc. I'm not sure what difference that would make anyway. So yeah, that's the basic idea. The specifics, I would want to get into those two constraints and how you derive this conclusion. It's like, oh, if you add some, this further constraint is Q, and then okay, we can put this. You can drive the kind of range of possible values for the prior on that hypothesis, and then find the maximum posterior on it. And yeah, so with those two constraints, again, that the bare non-design hypothesis is not antecedently more likely than the bare design hypothesis is not antecedently more likely than the bare non-design hypothesis. And the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare design hypothesis does not exceed the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare non-design hypothesis. We can infer that for whichever design hypothesis you might invoke, so long as it makes the assumptions of the bare design hypothesis and more, at least, right? It will not be favored by the data in the sense that the posterior will not of the one hypothesis will not exceed the posterior of the other. And that's something I think I can just show mathematically. Again, I need to hold the... and so let me just, on your specific formulation and post it in the text here, if the first premise is just saying something about like the Bayes factor, right? That, like, for example, that is to say, the Bayes factor is rough, when we're comparing one hypothesis to another, you're looking at the likelihood of some data given the first divided by the likelihood of that data given the second. It might be quite high when we're comparing the design hypothesis, some specific one, with the bare non-design hypothesis. If that's all we mean by favoring, then actually I think the argument's sound, right? But that doesn't get anywhere, because the conclusion that you might want to infer that the design hypothesis is more likely given that data than the non-design hypothesis, I deny, right? And that denial of that is consistent with the soundness of the argument. On the other hand, if the first premise is saying something about the posteriors, right, then the likelihood of the first theory given that data is greater than the likelihood of the second theory given that data. Then the first premise is just false, because that you can develop a counterexample quite trivially where you make the priors different enough so that the result doesn't follow. And really, there's not much more for me to say on that. Under the first interpretation, the arguments sound, perhaps, but uninteresting because it doesn't get the desired conclusion. It doesn't get us to the conclusion that design is more likely than non-design. And on the second interpretation, the first premise is just false. And I think all of this could be understood with respect to the criticism that I've been giving, although not making entirely explicit, because it's, again, just kind of boring mathematics.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, so to go back to ATA, the awesome theistic argument. Like,
Yes.
yeah, I agree with you that it's a likelihood parameter. But I think in the ATA argument, the reason why it works is because we've got independent reason to maybe think that maybe there might be a God who wants to communicate with us through scripture. That piece of evidence, and that's what's motivating the theory and allows us to get a good comparison. If there was no such thing as the Bible, and we found this word thing written on it, yeah, we wouldn't really know what to do with it or what to do with the evidence if we don't have independent motivation for positing the theory. Making something up after that would be ad hoc. So, like, my contention is basically that fine-tuning is good evidence for theism over naturalism, in the same sense that the ATA, the Gospel of John, on every atom would be powerful evidence for theism over naturalism. Now, you could accept, like, ATA and then say after that, it's like, oh, the antecedent improbability of the God of the Bible, it's so low because of whatever the problem with evil or whatever other reasons you want to stick in. And then say, yeah, even though that Gospel of John on every atom, that's really compelling evidence. That's not enough evidence to make you believe in God. So similarly, I think I allow that. Like, you can set the price for God really low, but you still have. But a part of the ATA is the concession that this Gospel of John, it's really powerful evidence for theism over naturalism, and similarly, I think fine-tuning is really powerful evidence for theism over naturalism.
Yeah, good. I kind of made a couple comments on this already, but I'll try to make it more comprehensive. The first thing to note is that I'm not just saying that, I want to set the priors for theism really low. Actually, let's be clear, my initial constraint I thought was very charitable. My antecedent on the designer hypothesis was equal to my antecedent my prior probability on the non-design hypothesis. If that's not setting the prior on theism very low, I think that's being incredibly charitable. And I think my point still goes through. But let me talk specifically on this awesome argument. So if the argument is framed as just like the fine-tuning argument, where we just say the likelihood of the data, this atom writing or star writing, whatever, on the naturalism, or again, I don't want to go naturalism theism. Design hypothesis is somewhat high, at least not incredibly low, and the likelihood of that data on the non-design hypothesis is much lower, perhaps vanishingly small. And then you have the constraint on the priors, and then you conclude condition on the data, and then you conclude that the design hypothesis exceeds. I'm going to reject that for the same reason. However, I do think that that data is strong evidence for some design, or at least powerful agent hypothesis, if we incorporate other data. That is, other data having to do with what we know about those sorts of linguistic expressions, how they tend to be created. They tend to be created by things with linguistic competence. In the case of if it's biblical scripture, we also know that it's strongly correlated with some other linguistic expression that we've already observed, which suggests like there being some connection between them, and some agent probably responsible. That altogether, I think, when we condition on that data, we're going to get, I think, pretty compelling evidence for there being at least some sort of powerful agent responsible for that data. That seems to me quite reasonable. However, the thing to note is that despite that, the sort of argument that we would make that is perfectly analogous to the fine-tuning argument fails, I think, for the same reason. And the argument that we've made here on this, taking into consideration this further data about agents and how these expressions tend to be created and so on, stuff like that, we do get the conclusion that it favors, in terms of the posterior, that some designer or powerful agent hypothesis. We don't have anything analogous in the fine-tuning case. It's not like, we know that agents tend to create universes with certain parameters or something like that. Like, there's not anything analogous there. And so the ways in which the arguments are the same, they both fail. And the ways in which they're different, the awesome argument might succeed, but the other one doesn't. If that makes sense. So, so again, I'm willing to grant that the atom writing or star writing data is strong evidence for a designer or powerful agent hypothesis, given other facts about those, like how linguistic tokens tend to be produced and so on. It's not strong evidence if we don't incorporate any of that data, because we're just going to run the same Bayesian argument and run into the same problem. And in the fine-tuning case, we don't have any other data like that. And without it, we run into the same problem. And I think if we did have other data like that, of course, that could be brought to bear. And perhaps there's some other argument that could be made for a fine-tuning, a creator. But it's more than just the regular fine-tuning argument. It's something else. And I'm not saying that there can be no such thing. I'm just saying that the Bayesian argument, just based on this data,
Yo, what's going on, guys?
fails.
Yo, Detroyer. Detroyer, do you
I'm
prefer
sorry,
this to be like a one-on-one, or you don't mind like?
For now, I think for now we're just talking one, but maybe we'll open it in a bit. I don't know if.
Who's the guy you're talking to?
Alessandro. I think he wants to go.
Yo, Alessandro, you want this to be one-on-one, or do you mind if other people like get in?
One-on-one for now, but I'm sure we can open it up after.
Yeah, I see. You're like a pussy. Yeah. Okay.
Come on, Venus. Come on.
Yeah. So,
you know, if I got in, I would like sexually molest you. But okay, I'll let you go on with the trial.
Yeah.
Like,
So
I know people don't like how I sometimes approach these things.
But the thing is, like, I'll tell you this thing, like, Detroyer is, like, smarter than me, and he knows more philosophy than me, but, like, if I was right now, I would, like, have, like, raped you and, like, made you cry by
Okay,
now.
please,
Personally, if I
please,
was, like,
no.
here, I would have, like, made you cry by now. You're just, like, lucky you're just, like, the Detroyer. But I'll let you continue on.
Okay.
Like, I would have, like, ruined your
Please,
asshole by now. Just so you know.
Venus, please.
Yo,
Please,
as
Venus,
much
come on.
as much as I do love your debates, if they want a 1v1, they can have a 1v1. But
Beautiful, isn't it?
well, I mean, I like to keep up the server reputation of, like, if people who are debating request a certain policy, we'll like do that for them. I do think that eventually you should hear Venus out. But if they want
Yeah.
1v1 for now, then we'll respect that.
Yeah. All right. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on my on the stuff I said about the awesome analogy argument, or if you want me to clarify what I said there.
Yeah. So I guess I somewhat agree with you. I think, and I definitely agree with you that the beer design hypothesis doesn't do the work that you'd probably need. But I think theism would do the work. Theism would give you some reason to think that the world is not life permitting. And I think, like, part of those things about, like, linguistic features, that's what makes it so that the hypothesis is not ad hoc. So I think, like, theism, like, what I think what you can do is part of a cumulative case, like somebody like Robin Collins or Richard Swinburne would do, is that there's other features of the universe that also point to evidence for theism, and that's part of a cumulative case. So that the hypothesis of theism is not ad hoc, it's independently motivated, and it
Right.
enjoys a really good likelihood Bayes factor boost from all these fine-tuning probabilities, which are basically astronomically improbable on some kind of naturalistic worldview or some worldview similar to that.
Yeah. Well, so 3 things. First, again, it's true, right? That I'll just willing to grant that it's astronomically unlikely on, say, the bare non-design hypothesis. I also think it's astronomically unlikely on the bare design hypothesis. And the fact that it might be more likely on some more specific design hypothesis doesn't entail that, like, given the data, that hypothesis is more likely than the bare non-design hypothesis, for the reasons I've already talked about. Now you say, oh, but okay, the bare design hypothesis, perhaps that won't do the work, but even something like bare theism will, or at least might. Perhaps it would do the work in the sense that it would more strongly predict the data, but it's going to fall into the same issue. That is to say, we're going to add more detail to the bare design hypothesis, whatever theism entails. Again, if it's involves something like being loving, that might more strongly predict that there would be life, and so life permitting conditions. But we're adding on to the hypothesis in a way that's going to lower the antecedent, lower the prior probability on that hypothesis. And given the constraints that I've talked about, it's going to lower it enough so that the posterior on the design hypothesis you're proposing, be it bare theism or whatever, will not exceed the posterior on the bare non-design hypothesis. And again, and as well, you point out this thing about a cumulative case. There's other things to support the design or theistic hypothesis, and perhaps it has other theoretical virtues. Well, I think those things are worth discussing on their own. I'm just pointing out that I don't think the Bayesian fine-tuning argument succeeds at all. It doesn't contribute whatsoever to a cumulative case. So whatever other case you have, I think this is not contributing to that case at all. Perhaps you have some other case, and perhaps you have some other way of preferring theories distinct from something merely Bayesian. And that's fine, we can talk about that. But the point is that this argument is something strictly Bayesian, and I don't think the conclusion is correct. I don't think the argument is sound. So whatever else you want to say about, oh, I have these other features that support deism or designer hypothesis, we can discuss it. I don't think it's going to help this argument, which I just think fails.
Yeah. But looking at the specific improbabilities in the fine tuning, you've got like 1 in 10 to the power 34, 1 in 10 to the power 37, 1 in 10 to the power of 120, 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. You've got like this huge change in posterior probability. And so if, say, I have like this beatheistic hypothesis, and I say like, okay, there's a God, and this God is loving, would that lower the prior probability to such a degree that it's going to outweigh the 10 to the 10 to the power of 123, 10 to the power 59, 10 to the power of 55. I don't think it really lowers it that much. Even if you say that there's a God that's loving, maybe I might put it at 1 in 100, but it's still being outweighed by that huge posterior boost we're getting from the really specific evidence of fine tuning.
Yeah, so I think it will lower it that much. In fact, the fact that it would lower it that much just follows from the constraints that I laid out. I could go through those constraints again, and if you want, I could send you or walk through the derivation that it would lower it that much. But again, the derivation I have is entirely general. Whatever additional feature you add into the hypothesis, be it lovingness or whatever, it's still we're going to get the same problem. So again, those two constraints were the bare design hypothesis is not antecedently more likely than the bare non-design hypothesis, constraint 1, and constraint 2, the likelihood of light-permitting conditions on the bare design hypothesis does not exceed the likelihood of light-permitting conditions on the bare non-design hypothesis. And whatever you add into, given those two constraints, if you have some additional hypothesis, which takes the assumptions of the bare design hypothesis but adds in other things, for example, that it's a loving God, I can just, it doesn't matter what you add in, I'm just going to, I could just derive from the two constraints that I already laid out and just uncontroversial facts about probabilities that the posterior on your hypothesis, given the data that there's life-permitting conditions, will not exceed the posterior on my bare non-design hypothesis given the data. Then that's perfectly general. And the conclusion from that, and you can show this because this is one of the steps to get to that conclusion, is that the prior on that design hypothesis that adds in the further details is just going to be quite small. And if you want to fill in the numbers for fine tuning, so those two conditional probabilities, the probability of light-permitting conditions on the bare design hypothesis versus on the bare non-design hypothesis. If you want to fill in a number for that and say, oh, that's 10 to the negative 1,000, it doesn't matter. Then you're going to get a prior probability on if your specific design hypothesis predicts life-permitting conditions with say 10% likelihood, right, or higher. I'm just going to be able to derive a prior on that hypothesis given those constraints that's vanishingly small, such that it satisfies the conclusions that I've already talked about. So, I mean, again, I could walk through some of the derivations here. That's just the point. It's not, you can't just say, oh, I think the prior on that loving designer hypothesis is like 1 in 100. If it is, then it contradicts the other constraints that I've made, or otherwise it contradicts kind of uncontroversial facts about probabilities. And well, I think the constraints are correct, and so this 1 in 100 is wrong. In fact, it's going to be something enormously smaller.
Yeah, I really don't think that's clear, and I think like if I can join something to like the bare theistic. I'm not interested in discussing the bare design hypothesis or the theistic hypothesis. But if I condition something onto that theistic hypothesis, it's gonna lower the prior probability, but that's by virtue of the content in the theistic hypothesis itself. It's not like no. I think definitely you've gone wrong in saying that the priors would be lowered by the same amount. Yeah,
Yo,
By the
Detroyer.
same amount.
yeah,
Hang on.
because
I don't know what same amount compared to what. We're just
like
talking about the prior on this hypothesis.
like say like say you have theism and I add on that that this God is loving. You're saying that whatever I add on to that theistic hypothesis is going to be equivalent to whatever specific probabilities we have from the base factor in fine tuning. I don't think that's clear at all. I think it's plausibly wrong, in fact.
Well, it being wrong again is going to require that at least one of my two constraints are wrong, or something is wrong in my derivation.
Could
Although I haven't made
you
the derivation explicit.
could you explain your constraints? Because I think your constraints are wrong.
Yeah. So the two constraints were as follows. One. Also, I do want to mention, just for clarity, when I talk about bare design and bare non-design, I'm not saying that what you have to have in mind is a bare design hypothesis. The point of talking about the bare design hypothesis is for the purpose of my derivation of, making a perfectly general conclusion about what the priors and posteriors can be on the different design hypotheses you might have. And so the bare design hypothesis is just kind of like a baseline. Anyway, the two constraints are as follows. One, the prior on the bare design hypothesis does not exceed the prior on the bare non-design hypothesis. And for sake of argument in my derivation, I actually just set them equal. Somebody who is that I think is very charitable, but for sake of argument, I think it's pretty fair. All right, that's the first one. The second constraint is that the likelihood of life-permitting conditions, given the bare design hypothesis, does not exceed the likelihood of life-permitting conditions, given the bare non-design hypothesis. And for simplicity in the argument, in my derivation, I let them be equal. Those are my two constraints, and the rest of it is just kind of mathematical derivation.
Could you repeat the second constraint? Because I think that's plausibly false.
Yeah, that's the one that I would expect some pushback on. There's one kind of significant response or criticism of that I didn't address in the first video that I'm going to address in the second. I could talk about it now, but it's kind of a lengthy point about simplicity and whatever. But anyway, the second constraint again is that the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare design hypothesis does not exceed the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare non-design hypothesis. In other words, the bare design hypothesis doesn't more strongly predict life-permitting conditions than the bare non-design hypothesis.
Yeah. I guess I'm honestly not sure if that's true. I think like even granting that for the sake of argument, if I attach stuff onto the design hypothesis, I agree it lowers. I agree that it lowers the priors, and
But you're going to say it doesn't lower it so much.
yeah. It definitely doesn't lower it in a way that you've got this astronomical base factor from the fine tuning.
Yeah, but you can say that, but the whole point of my argument is that I can just mathematically derive that it would, and I could walk through the derivation now. I could even
but I think like even it'll be plausibly false because well, whatever you add on that's gonna lower the priors in relation to what's already in the design hypothesis. So
Correct.
I could. Yeah. So I could. I'm saying like it's difficult to sub ad hoc hypotheses, but if I added in like stuff that was independently motivated that led me to believe qualities of this designer,
Uh,
then I think that might lower the priors a little bit, but not enough to.
no, hang
Uh,
on. If you had independent motivation for those
independent motivation.
assumptions,
Yo, Troy.
that wouldn't hang on. That wouldn't raise the prior unless the prior is like already conditioning on other data. Like the other data might support your hypothesis, but that's just to say that there's might be other evidence apart from the fine tuning data to support your hypothesis. And actually, note that even if we grant that, if it turns out that say let's just suppose that when we approach the fine tuning data, our prior on the bare non-design hypothesis is lower. We actually think the bare design hypothesis is more likely. Well, the fine tuning data is not going to make it more likely than that, and for the same reason. So it's actually not even relevant. You might think that we have other reason for thinking that there is something with these features. I would contest that, but whatever, we could discuss it. But it's not going to help the fine tuning argument. So, yeah, I don't know if I want to get more into that.
Yeah. I feel like the points that you're making about prior probability are really contentious. Like if we go back to my ATA argument, I think if we go back to my ATA argument, you might say, so I think like even in the ATA argument, if we're like weighing in on hypotheses, you might think, adding in stuff about this designer, it's gonna lower the prior probability. I've got my background evidence about how linguistic symbols come to be, so that's why I think that it doesn't lower the priors on this designer being able to create linguistic features. So adding in like something like that, designer speaks English, that lowers the prior probability a little bit. But that's the way I think about it in the ATA argument.
No. I don't think so. The other data is not going to make a difference to the prior. It will make a difference if we conditionalize on that data. That is to say, I think that data will strongly support that data plus the fact that we have these star writing or atom writing examples is going to strongly confirm some powerful agent or design hypothesis. But it's not going to make a difference to the prior, unless, of course, we're talking about in a chain of reasoning where we've already conditioned on some of that data before taking into account some of this data. I mean, maybe. But the point is that with the fine-tuning case, sorry, go ahead.
So let's say like we're conditioning the data for the priors on God. I take it to like this independent motivation that some people have religious experiences that lead them to believe God is loving, or like some other argument, like the argument from the beauty of the fundamental mathematical structures of the universe that some physicists are not more likely to believe that there's intelligence behind these laws. And I condition that into the priors when I'm evaluating God.
Yeah, so again, that's not going to help the fine-tuning argument. That's just going to, if let's just grant that those are good Bayesian inferences, and our prior on we've done that before considering the fine-tuning data, and so our kind of prior going in on the designer hypothesis of that particular sort is somewhat high. It's not astronomically low, at least. It's true that after you condition on the fine-tuning data it's going to be higher than on your posterior on that designer hypothesis is going to be higher, perhaps, than the non-design hypothesis. But it's not going to be. My point is that it's not going to be higher than it was before. So I guess.
So let me do an illustration. Like, let's say, suppose I'm a guy and I'm reading philosophy. I study arguments, and I think like probably there's a 10% chance God is real, and a 90% chance naturalism is true. And let's say I look at the fine-tuning evidence. And this in this 10%, it's that that God is real, God is moral, God is loving, and he goes and he looks at this fine-tuning evidence and he wants to weigh it, and he comes in with those probabilities. So you're saying that even after considering the fine-tuning evidence, he would still be a 10% God, 90% naturalism?
Yeah. So to really go through it, I would want to kind of fill in some more numbers as an example.
Yeah,
But,
no, like say like he's decided like he conditioned all his information, and he's saying that the prior probability is 10% God, 90% naturalism, and he looks at the fine-tuning evidence and and he uses the base factor, so he's gonna still come out at 10% God, 90% naturalism.
Yeah. So you can take the derivation that I haven't stated here, but I've kind of hinted at is in the more complicated version is actually in the video. The more streamlined general version I have in a document. It's going to be in the follow-up video. You can take that and reject the first constraint and say that the prior on the design hypothesis, the bare design hypothesis, is higher, or even much higher if you want, than on the bare non-design hypothesis. And if you follow it all through, you're going to conclude that your posterior is higher on the bare design hypothesis, and perhaps also on more specific design hypotheses. But you're not going to conclude that it was higher than it was antecedently. Well, actually, that's not exactly right.
Yeah, I think
You're not going to conclude. Sorry, let me put this a bit more precisely. You're not going to conclude that it's higher than the prior on the bare design hypothesis was. It might be higher than your posterior on a specific design hypothesis might be higher than the antecedent on that specific hypothesis, but it's not going to be higher than the antecedent on the bare design hypothesis.
Okay, so yeah. And I still don't understand some of the statements you make. So
That's fine.
yeah, yeah. I just like it just baffles me that I could come in like say I set my priors. I think it's 10% likely it's God, and 90% likely it's naturalism. And then
Yeah.
I weigh the base factor, and I come out and I try to evaluate my posterior possibility at the end. You're saying that after considering the evidence, that his probability of God would not have raised at all.
Yeah, but hang on. You got to understand the point that I'm making is that you can say, "Oh, this is my prior. It's 10%, 90%, whatever," and this is my conditional probability. You can say that, but again, if my initial constraints are correct, then what you're saying is incorrect, right? So, you know, if we want to resolve this problem, we gotta figure out which is incorrect. And I think the constraints that I set are correct, and not this, priors that you bring to the table.
Yeah. I think something's wrong in your constraints. Like say
Well, it's going to
like
have
we
to
could
be the
use
second constraint, correct?
yeah. So say like we use a different case. Like let's say there's a bidder, and before the
You say a
murder.
builder? Is that what you said?
Oh, a murder.
A murder.
Like,
Okay, sorry.
like a killing, and
Yeah.
and say like I'm thinking going into this trial, there's a 10% chance it's Matthew, and maybe a 90% chance it's John. Then they discover the murder weapon, and it's in John's house, and no, it's in Matthew's house, and then so somebody does a probabilistic evaluation, a man,
Mhm.
there's a 1 in 100 chance that the murder weapon would be at Matthew's house. If he
Sure.
was not the murderer. And I consider that evidence. I weigh the competing possibilities of Matthew and John doing it, and I use my priors, and I weigh it with that specific evidence. And you're going to
Yeah.
come out with Matthew coming out ahead because the murder weapon. It's really improbable under the John theory.
Mhm.
So you agree with that, right?
Yeah. The
Yeah.
analogy though.
Then if you agree with that, and you say yeah, priors are difficult to determine in many cases. But
Mhm.
even if say like you say my prior for God is like it's 95% naturalism and 5% God, I'm going to look at the probabilities in the fine-tuning argument, these astronomically small probabilities, and that's going to give a really big boost to God. That's the approach
Yeah, the disanalogy between the murder case and the fine-tuning case, as I see it, is that we have these reasonable constraints that constrain what the priors can be. So you can't observe both of these constraints and just say, "Oh, my prior is 5% on theism," because those constraints and your prior are going to be inconsistent with each other, mathematically speaking. So again, if you want to say, "Oh, but I'm going to maintain these priors or these conditional probabilities or whatever," then either it's going to be consistent with the constraints that I bring, and so my criticism goes through, or it's going to be inconsistent with them, and then then we have to discuss what was wrong either about my constraints or the kind of derivation that I went through. And this conversation is going to go nowhere if you just say, "But these are my priors, and like something must be wrong." We'd have to get into the details. What's wrong with my constraints? I think they're correct. I think I could, if you want me to talk more about them, I could try to motivate them more. I would also want to talk about the. I would also want to talk about the additional criticism that I would want that I didn't cover in the first video that I will in the second. But that's where it would have to go. It's not just going to say, "Oh, I can just bring my priors to the table and calculate on that," because
yeah.
that
I
requires
think
that my
like
constraints are wrong.
the priors. I think because honestly, it's really baffling to me that you don't think it raises the posterior probability at all.
Hang on, let me be clear. I think it will raise the probability of certain, designer hypotheses. In other words, your antecedent probability on your prior probability on some designer hypothesis, your posterior on that hypothesis might be much higher than your prior on that hypothesis. But my point is that the posterior will not exceed the posterior or the prior on the bare non-design hypothesis. So,
I guess I want to take this tack. Like you're saying that there's constraints that you're putting on the fine-tuning case, and these constraints aren't applicable for the ATA, the awesome theistic argument case,
no. Well,
and they're not
they are in one.
applicable, and they're not applicable for the murder case with Matthew and John. Yeah.
So, well, hang on. But for the ATA case, they are applicable in one sense and not in another. The sense in which they are applicable is if we make the Bayesian inferences perfect analogs to each other, where we're just talking about there's this fact that there's atom writing, such and such likelihood on a designer hypothesis, such and such likelihood on no design, Bayesian inference, therefore the design hypothesis is more likely. That I think we can and should bring the same constraints to bear, and that argument would be rejected. Now, if we incorporate, again, further information, further background evidence about statements, linguistic utterances, and so on, then that is going to favor the designer, or at least powerful agent hypothesis, in a way that
Right.
the mere fact that there are those, yeah.
So say for the ATA case, you're bringing background evidence from agents, and say for the universe designer case, I'm bringing in background evidence from religious experience, from other arguments from God.
But then
but in ATA,
in both cases, although you're not actually servicing or helping their like fine tuning argument, you're providing other evidence which supports the same conclusion. So in other words, you could have just made an argument based on that other evidence, and ignored the fine tuning inference because it didn't serve anything.
No, but in the ATA evidence, you could say that doesn't serve anything. So for I'm saying that, like, for example, if ATA happened, we could all agree that ATA by itself, that'd be powerful evidence to God, even if you're bringing in like minor background evidence. And I'm saying that as part, say, like, my contention is as part of a cumulative case for theism, similar that ATA would be powerful evidence in my cumulative case for theism, fine-tuning would be powerful evidence in my cumulative case.
Well, wait, it depends on how you're characterizing the ATA. If the data or the evidence is the fact that there is atom writing plus certain background information about agents and linguistic expressions and so on, then I would agree that would be quite good evidence for some sort of designer or powerful agent hypothesis.
But you're so like say
in that case, the mere fact that there is atom writing is not going to be. And if that's all we have in the fine-tuning case, the mere fact that there are life-threatening conditions is also not going to be. Of course, if we have other data that bears on, that you could like conjoin with the fine-tuning data, or the fact that the universe is life-permitting, such that we have something analogous to the beefed-up ATA case, then sure, we might have a good argument to make. But the mere fact that there's fine-tuning itself doesn't add anything.
But like but we agree that ATA is powerful evidence, and maybe like to interpret it, we need to begin background information about agents and such, and say like but my argument is based on ATA, and if I did not have the ATA evidence, my evidence for believing in God is stronger after. My posterior probability for God will be stronger after I've looked at ATA. After I've looked at, let's say, like, you have a guy with no priors, or whatever priors, and you feed him information about agents. And then you feed him the information about atom writing. After that, his posterior probability for God is going to go way up, because that's something that's astronomically improbable under non-things. And similarly, I'm saying, like, say you have somebody and you feed them maybe background information about religious experience or the other arguments from God, even if he's putting his probability of God. So when I feed him the FTA argument, his posterior is going to go way up, similar to how it would go way up if I fed somebody the ATA argument.
Yeah, so again, you might have other data which supports designer, be it the stuff from the ATA or something else to do with religious experiences or whatever. And if you want to say that raises your credence or rational probability on theism or design hypothesis? I mean, we can discuss that, but for the purposes of this discussion, that's fine. The point is that the Bayesian fine-tuning argument doesn't help. Yeah, and it doesn't matter if the, when you employ the Bayesian fine-tuning argument, your prior on theism is like fairly high. It's not gonna, it's not going to, the data, the mere fact that there's the universe is light permitting is not gonna make it higher. So again, the data is not gonna help there.
Yeah. Okay, right. So like, okay, let's walk through this example. Say you have an agent.
I want
a
to be very clear. Strictly speaking, I want to correct myself slightly. It's not going to make it higher than the prior on the bare design hypothesis, because it might make it higher again than on the prior on that specific design hypothesis.
Okay, like say you've got like this alien who doesn't know much about it, and then you feed this alien information about linguistic features in the English language. And now you present, and this alien has some certain prior probability of God, whatever it is. Even if his probability of God, it's like 0.1 out of 100. And then you feed this alien the ATA information. He's already had his background information about agents and linguistic features. Do you think his posterior probability of God is going to go way up?
Assuming I followed that correctly, yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to go way up because it's such an astronomically unlikely thing that ATA would happen. Posterior on God is going to go way up.
Right.
Okay. Right. So and let's say you've got a similar case. You have this alien, and you feed him background information about religious experience. You feed him the other arguments from God, and like this alien is like, I don't really buy this God concept. I think maybe there's a 1% chance in God, and maybe like a 99% chance of naturalism. And then you feed the alien this fine-tuning evidence. Is his posterior probability of God going to go up?
The posterior on the bare design hypothesis or on the specific?
No, on the theistic, on the God hypothesis.
Yeah, plausibly. So let me just state clearly what I think would happen here in these various cases, mathematically speaking. So if we have, let's suppose that we have some. Wait, are you bringing to bear the stuff about religious experiences as well? Is that correct?
Yeah. Let's just say that.
So, suppose you do that. You do that first, and let's just suppose that our prior before that was like on the bare design hypothesis, and the bare non-design hypothesis was like 50-50, like equal. I guess we could suppose that. I don't know. Maybe they're exhausted then. And when you incorporate that data, let's say it goes 80 for design hypothesis, bare design hypothesis. Now, any more specific design hypothesis will be like at most 80, probably be less if it's whatever.
So the question, what do you think?
This was the 80-20. Now when you take the fine-tuning data, or the fact that the universe is light permitting, and let's suppose that you have a more specific design hypothesis, not the bare design one. Its prior is going to be much less than 80, and its posterior is going to be at most 80. So in other words, when we condition on that data, it's never going to raise. It might raise the prior on that specific. Might raise the probability on the specific design hypothesis, but it's never going to raise it above what our prior was on the bare design hypothesis.
Yeah, I think you putting constraints on the posterior is wrong. Because would you put a constraint in the posterior on this alien who's heard about how human agents and linguistic features? He hasn't heard the ATA evidence yet. And he gets fed the ATA evidence. What's happening there in your statistical model?
In the ATA case?
Yeah. Like,
So when we, in the case of if you want to think about it in a Bayesian way, the likelihood that you would have that your theistic model would be true, given that data, might be relatively high. In other words, it does it does strongly predict, or at least somewhat predict the theory. The data somewhat predicts that theory. And so when we condition on that, you follow you're going to do your Bayesian inference, and it might exceed the prior on the. I think it would. It would even exceed the. So if the bare design hypothesis is something that would at least somewhat predict all of that data, that there would be certain facts about linguistic tokens and the atom writing or whatever, at least more strongly than on its denial, then you could raise your posterior on even the bare design hypothesis or some more specific one could exceed the prior even on the bare design hypothesis. But I would want to work that out more. I feel like, we could talk more about that. I'm struggling to see the relevance here, because it seems to me that it's all going to come down to the constraints and derivation that seem to like the basis of my critique. And unless we're going to reject some of those or the inference, the derivation, just talk about other hypotheses isn't going to help, unless it's it bears on the truth of those.
Because I think ATA is a really good analogy at and if your model, if it's failing when it's trying to consider ATA, then I think we should probably reject your model. So I agree that it's really difficult to determine priors. If I wanted to compare general relativity and Newtonian mechanics, it's really hard to know what the prior is. But I'm saying, on my view, basically, if say there was some guy, let's say he's a super strong atheist, and he thinks maybe there's a 1% chance God is, but I really believe in naturalism, 99%. I think he should consider the fine-tuning evidence and see these vanishingly small probabilities on the naturalism side. And that's gonna give him a really, really powerful, significant reasons to raise his posterior on God. Extremely high.
I'm being way more charitable than that. I'm letting it be 0.5, let alone 1%. I still think it doesn't work. Unless you're saying 1% on the specific something that's stronger than the bare design hypothesis that would do the work of a fine-tuning argument. But then I'm going to reject. I think we have good support for these constraints on the priors that would be inconsistent with setting a prior of that sort. And you can say and of course it's right that it can be difficult to determine priors, but in some cases there might be reasons to adopt certain constraints on what those priors can be. And I think that's what we have here. And given what we have here, it rules out assigning a prior, 1%, say, to the hypothesis like that would do the work in the fine-tuning argument. So,
Definitely. I feel like if your constraints, if they're undercutting ATA, if the, I feel like I think everyone, like almost everyone, would conclude intuitively if like there was atom writing, if God did write the Gospel of John on an atom, then if God did write the Gospel of John on an atom, that would be really powerful evidence, and and I think somewhat your prayers are gonna go down if you assume that there's something like a God and he inspired something like the Bible. And you'd want us to know as I'm building this theory, but but in this case, the specific evidence is so astronomically unlikely that it's going to outweigh any additions I make to the priors. And I think something around your assumption not on priors is fundamentally wrong if it can't account for ATA. And
well, I think it can account for it. I think, again, if we're just talking about ATA in the narrow sense, not including other data about how linguistic tokens and reproduce stuff like that, then I don't think the argument is good and it's going to fail for the same reason. If we are including those things, then I think it would be a good argument and that we would have a higher posterior, perhaps a much higher posterior on some designer or powerful agent hypothesis. I mean, if you want, I could try to work through some with some sample numbers of how that would be the case and like show that that's
okay,
consistent with the
yeah. So
priors.
so question so I'm saying that just like say I'm presenting ATA evidence about linguistic tokens might be part of my cumulative case. You think in an analogous sense, I can present data on maybe religious experience or or the other arguments from God, and even if they're not that strong, the fine tuning evidence is going to give me a boost.
Yeah, you can have other data that's going to support your hypothesis.
But I think you talk equivocally because the way you talk is that I'm getting the sense that you want to say the posterior won't go up even if I have other data. The posterior won't go up.
Huh?
Like say I condition on the other data and then I add in the fine tuning data. You seem to be saying that the conditioning that the posterior won't go up.
No. There could be other data which does. I mean, this is something I said right at the outset. The constraints I have in mind here are constraints for this particular data that there's life-permitting conditions. I'm not saying that I have those two constraints are in place for other data. For example, a bare design hypothesis may more strongly predict, or maybe more likely on, if you want, there being grand linguistic expressions in the stars or in atoms. And when we incorporate that into a Bayesian inference, it does strongly support it. We're not licensed the inference that I want to draw about the fine-tuning data. So anything I'm saying here isn't going to rule out other inferences or Bayesian inferences towards a designer or a powerful agent. It's just I'm giving constraints on the priors and conditional probabilities. The conditional probabilities having to do with this data, that there's life-permitting conditions. Yeah, you could have other data that does really raise the prior significantly, either on the bare design hypothesis or on a more specific one. So that's the sense in which I don't think my response here undercuts ATA, or at least the stronger version of ATA where we're incorporating this other data. If we're not incorporating it, then I think my response does rule it out, but for a good reason.
So so basically, yeah, I think your constraints are plausibly false. Because even when you make associations like the linguistic data, that just comes down to a statistical association in the end. It's possible, it's logically possible on naturalism. You could have like the laws spell out First John just according to the physical laws. It's certainly logically possible. That thing is just another Bayesian inference. Where you talk about linguistic tokens and agents. That's just another Bayesian inference that you're sticking into your data set.
Right.
Yeah.
But
So I could stick in.
I'm not
so,
saying that any Bayesian inference would suffer the critique I'm raising. It's just when we have a Bayesian inference given these constraints. And I don't think for all of those they're going to be these same constraints or something analogous. So I do have to go in a few minutes. We can open it up. I just want to kind of reiterate my main point. It seems to me that your issue is going to be with the constraints that I have, and you want to, in order to contest them, you might want to ask me for further support for them, or you might want to say, well, here's which one or ones I think are wrong, or you might want to say, which it seems to me that you're trying to do, I don't think very successfully, is to show that my constraints lead to problematic conclusions elsewhere. And I don't think they lead to problematic conclusions in the case that you bring up. So that's where it seems to me that we're kind of stuck. The constraints seem pretty reasonable to me. They don't lead to any problem in this other case. And if we want to, if you want me to motivate them further or discuss the derivation, I'm fine to do that. But that's kind of where we're stuck right now.
I guess since you want to leave, do you want to make a final statement, and I can make my final statement?
Sure. So I guess maybe some more people have joined since we started, so I'll try to summarize my main point again. The central issue with the Bayesian fine-tuning argument, it seems to me, is that while the designer hypothesis might more strongly predict the data, that there'd be life-permitting conditions, it's a more complicated, more substantive hypothesis than the alternative, the non-design hypothesis, such that it will have a lower prior. And in fact, given two constraints that I've laid out a few times already, the difference in the priors will cancel out the base factor, so that the posterior on your design hypothesis, whichever design hypothesis you have, will not exceed the posterior on the bare non-design hypothesis given the life-permitting conditions. And again, those two constraints are the likely our prior on the bare non-design hypothesis is not lower than the prior on the bare design hypothesis. I guess I said it the reverse way the previous time, but whatever. And the second constraint is that the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare design hypothesis does not exceed the likelihood of life-permitting conditions on the bare non-design hypothesis. And given those constraints and some, I think, just solid mathematical derivation, we can conclude that whatever more specific designer hypothesis you might have in mind, it might more strongly predict the data, the life-permitting conditions are just going to have a correspondingly lower prior, and so will not come out ahead overall when we condition on the data. And there are some issues raised up with respect to another example where there's like either writing in the stars or writing on atoms that corresponds to like the verses of John, or it doesn't really matter whether it's John or, any sort of writing I think will do. And the point is that, this is the way Luke Barnes puts it, is that if your response to fine-tuning entails that data doesn't support a designer, then your response goes wrong, because that clearly does. And my response to this is kind of twofold. If the data is just that there is these symbols or whatever in this way, or the stars arranged in this way, then I do think that my critique does rule that out as a good argument, but rightly so. And if the data incorporates, or taking as background, facts about how linguistic tokens or whatever tend to be produced, and that sort of stuff, then when we condition on all of that data, the fact that there are those tokens and these facts about how such tokens can be produced, we're going to have decent and perhaps very powerful evidence for a designer, or at least some sort of powerful agent. And that's consistent with my response given on the mere fine-tuning case and the response given on the narrowly conceived like atom writing case. We could get more into the details of that, and also more into the details of the motivation for the constraints and the derivation from those constraints to my ultimate conclusion. But we didn't really get that far in that today. That's my main position, nevertheless. And again, I want to say, you can say, oh, I have this, but here's my prior on theism. Here's, in particular, theistic hypothesis. Here's the conditional probabilities. And, the likelihood of that there'd be life-permitting conditions on with the hypothesis that there isn't a designer is like astronomically low. And the likelihood on my hypothesis, it's maybe it's low, but it's not nearly so astronomically low. And so when we incorporate that data, there's powerful evidence for my hypothesis. Well, again, you can say that, but the constraints that you assume there, the priors and the conditional probabilities, are either consistent or not consistent with the constraints that I have in mind about the bare designer, bare non-design hypothesis, and so on. If they're consistent with it, then your argument won't be sound because for reasons already deduced. And if they're inconsistent with it, then something must be wrong. I think it's not my constraints. I think it's your constraints. And we could talk about that further.
Okay, yeah, so I think what I wanted to argue that the fine-tuning argument, it's powerful evidence for theism and powerful arguments and powerful evidence against naturalism in the same sense that if we discovered writing on atoms, that'd be really powerful evidence for theism. I put forth 4 premises. I think he mostly agreed to them, but his main problem had to do with the priors. In premise 1, we had the theories T1 and T2. If the evidence it's much more probable under theory 1 than theory 2, then the evidence strongly favors T1 over T2. Now we put in the data of the fine-tuning, the likelihood that a life-permitting universe exists on naturalism. And from science, we know that this is incredibly small. Look at the gravitational constant, 1 in 10 to the power 34. Electromagnetic versus force of gravity, 1 in 10 to the 37. Cosmological constant, 1 in 10 to the 120. Initial entropy, 1 in 10 to the 10 to the power of 123. It's like vanishingly small. The likelihood that a life-permitting universe exists on theism is not vanishingly small. But even if you think there's a 1 in 100 chance that God would create a life-permitting universe, or a 1 in 1,000 chance, it's still way outweighed by these astronomical improbabilities on naturalism's side. Thus, when we do this and look at the Bayes factor, we see the existence of a life-permitting universe strongly favors theism over naturalism. Yeah, priors are difficult to determine and they're somewhat subjective, but I definitely think that this is powerful evidence that's gonna raise the posterior probability once you take the Bayes factor into account. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm trying to open it up, or Isaac, if you want to. I have to drive somewhere. I might not be here, but yeah, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks both of you for debating, of course. I know that Venus wants to have a crack at you, Alessandro. I mean, he's kind of aggro, but he is a smart guy. He's got a master's in Phil. He's actually probably one of the smartest people in the server. You want to talk to him for a bit?